To truly understand the blue wall of silence and the fight for police accountability, we have to travel back in time. We're heading to the late 1980s, to New York City's 75th Precinct, a place that became ground zero for one of the most explosive corruption scandals in American history. This is the story of Michael Dowd, a cop who didn't just bend the rules, he shattered them, using his badge not as a shield for the public, but as a license for crime. This case is a cornerstone for understanding why projects like Broken Shield are so critical today. Michael Dowd didn't join the force with a master plan to become a kingpin. His descent began with a sense of disillusionment. Stationed in one of the most dangerous precincts in the country, he saw an opportunity. He realized he could make more money by compromising his integrity than by upholding his oath. It started small, as it often does. But soon, with his partner, Kenny Urell, simple bribes escalated into a full-blown criminal enterprise operated from behind the badge. Their operation was shockingly sophisticated. They weren't just taking cash to look the other way. They were providing unauthorized armed escorts for drug traffickers. Ensuring their illicit shipments moved safely through the city, they were leaking tactical information, tipping off criminal crews right before police raids were about to happen, effectively sabotaging their own department's efforts. But their most audacious move was a form of asset seizure fraud. They used their police authority to intercept rival drug dealers, but instead of logging the confiscated cash and narcotics as evidence, they diverted it. They seized the assets for themselves, and then funneled them into their own distribution networks. They weren't just corrupt cops. They had become active players in the very drug trade they were sworn to combat. Dowd and his crew were running their own empire, all under the color of law. Now, what makes this case so essential to the conversation about accountability is that this behavior wasn't a secret. It was happening in plain sight. Michael Dowd wasn't hiding his wealth, flaunted it, driving luxury cars to work in a precinct where most residents were struggling to get by. His lifestyle was a glaring red flag, impossible to ignore. And it wasn't just his colleagues who noticed. Over the years, a staggering 16 separate internal complaints were filed against him. 16 times the system had a chance to act. 16 times it failed. The culture within the department at the time prioritized something they called departmental loyalty over actual ethics. The unwritten rule was simple. You don't rat on another cop. This blue wall of silence created a protective bubble around Dowd, allowing his criminal enterprise to flourish for nearly a decade. The internal mechanisms designed to police the police were either unwilling or unable to intervene. In the end, it wasn't his own department that brought him down. The break in the case came from an entirely different agency, the Suffolk County Police. They were running a major narcotics investigation, and as they followed the evidence, they made a shocking discovery. The primary targets of their drug trafficking probe weren't career criminals. They were active-duty NYPD officers. The arrest of Michael Dowd in 1992 sent shockwaves through the entire country. It was the Broken Shield moment that could no longer be ignored. The scandal was so immense that it triggered the formation of the Malin Commission, a landmark investigation tasked with rooting out institutional corruption within the NYPD. It was during his testimony before this commission that Dowd delivered one of the most chilling admissions ever heard from a police officer. He confessed that over time he had completely lost the ability to distinguish between his role as a cop and his identity as a criminal. He famously stated that he came to see his badge and his gun as a license to take. His credentials weren't a symbol of public trust. They were a tool to enable his greed. He was no longer a cop who was also a criminal. He was a criminal who happened to have a badge. In the aftermath of the Malin Commission, the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, or IAB, was forced to make changes. One of the most significant legacies of the Dowd scandal was the implementation of proactive integrity tests. These were essentially sting operations. IAB would create simulated crime scenes with planted assets like cash or valuables to see what an officer would do. Would they properly document the evidence and turn it in, or would they pocket it for themselves? The logic was clear. Michael Dowd had operated with impunity for years because there was no proactive oversight. These integrity tests became a mandatory, if controversial, tool to try and prevent another Dowd from rising through the ranks. The department had to prove it could police itself. So, with new reforms and integrity tests, the problem was solved, right? Well, not exactly. Decades later, advocates for police reform argue that while the methods have changed, the core issues persist. The blue wall of silence that protected Dowd hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. Today, it presents three major challenges to true accountability. First, there's the problem of professional retaliation. Whistleblowers, the good officers who report misconduct by their peers, often face severe consequences. They can be socially isolated, branded as a rat, and in the most dangerous scenarios. They might find their calls for backup are mysteriously delayed during life-threatening emergencies. This culture of silence makes it incredibly risky for anyone to speak up. Second, the nature of misconduct has shifted. The overt, brazen drug running of Dowd's era is less common now, partly because it's easier to catch. Modern corruption can be more subtle and harder to track. We're talking about things like massive overtime fraud, where officers are paid for hours they never worked, or the intentional disabling of body cameras and vehicle recording devices during critical incidents. These are quieter, more bureaucratic forms of misconduct, but they still represent a profound breach of public trust and cost taxpayers millions. And this brings us to the third and perhaps most fundamental challenge, the oversight paradox. Even with an internal affairs bureau, many critics argue that a system where police investigate themselves is inherently flawed. This IAB is typically staffed by fellow officers, who may one day return to a regular precinct. There's a perceived conflict of interest. Can they truly be impartial? This is why you hear a growing call for the establishment of truly independent civilian oversight boards. The key here is that these boards must have real power, including full subpoena power to compel testimony and access evidence to conduct their own unbiased investigations. Without that independence, many believe we're just rearranging the deck chairs, not fixing the underlying problem. The story of Michael Dowd isn't just a piece of history, it's a continuing lesson. It shows us how easily a shield meant to protect can be broken and reforged into a weapon for personal gain. It underscores the constant need for vigilance, transparency, and robust, independent oversight. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this deep dive valuable, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the complex world of accountability. We'll see you in the next video.